Hey everyone, welcome back to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker, Trent Horn. When I speak to people about the papacy, I'll present to them, arguments from scripture that seem to show that Peter had unique authority among the apostles, that he would often speak for them as a group. One interesting note that I like seeing in scripture or sharing with people is when you look at the lists of the apostles, in the apostolic lists that contain all of the apostles, I believe there are four of them. Peter is listed first in all of them, and Judas is listed last. So that, it's interesting. Well, why would that be? Well, Peter is the leader of the group. And so people will make these arguments, right? Trying to show that Peter had a very important role in the early church, and that provides evidence for the papacy. I came across an article from a Protestant blog, though, saying you could run these same exact arguments and say that Paul had a special primacy. Maybe Paul was really the first pope. Look at all these special things about Paul. If you're going to say special things about Peter make him pope, then special things about Paul make him pope as well. And then if everybody's a pope, nobody's a pope, and the argument doesn't work. To help us dismantle this argument, though, I've asked my friend Suan Sonna to come in. He's probably one of the most able defenders of the papacy out there today. And so I'm excited for him to break this argument down for us. So Suan, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Trent, thanks for having me on again.
Well, can you also share, you have some news, vocation news, if you will, which you can share with our listeners. I think they'd be excited to hear about.
Yeah, well, so I was accepted into the Dominican novice class of the Central Province. And so basically, come July 19th, I'll be in St. Louis. And then on August 3rd, I'll be in Denver, Colorado, starting my novice, kind of spirituality year, discerning with the Dominicans, wearing a habit and living the life. So I'll be off the grid, but I will be very much still in the church.
Oh, no, I am. Thank you. I mean, that's awesome. You've got yourself a giant brain there. The Dominicans are a giant brain trust. That's going to be amazing. I'm so excited to see that. So
Trent, I appreciate it.
Yeah. So let's, but you won't be gone. We'll be getting your service to the church will be amplified. I just know at the order of preachers, that's going to be good. Let's talk then about this article. So why don't you could summarize kind of the argument. I mean, I've summarized it a bit, but you could lead us into the argument, and then you had some specific points you wanted to address.
Yeah. So basically this article on this blog called, I think, Triablog, it has like 51 kind of examples of Pauline primacy. And the point of this article is to kind of parody Catholic arguments for Petrine primacy and show that you could run, as you said, the same arguments to show that Paul was the first pope. And I guess I'll just want to say a few things first, right? I mean, there is some value in parody objections, because if a parody objection works, then that shows you that there's something wrong with the argument that you've been using. So, for example, sometimes I see some Catholic apologists use, Peter is mentioned this many times in the scriptures, and that shows that he has a primacy. I mean, it can show that he is an important character, but I think I've also seen a lot of accounts that have Paul mentioned more than Peter. But I also don't think in the first place that's a good criterion to use, how many times someone gets name dropped, right?
Right.
The other thing, too, is that some of the parodies on this website...
if you think about it, Judas is mentioned more than many of the other minor apostles.
Yeah, right.
He's not more important.
Well, and then, I looked at some of these examples, and some of them were like bad, right? Like some of these parodies were not all that great. And so I was wondering, is that the point of the parody, to not be good? Or, because you'd want the parody to be good in that it kind of shows there's a flaw in how Catholic apologetics is done. So what I've decided today, Trent, is to just focus on maybe 6 of the examples that actually kind of worked or I thought were interesting. But I just want to begin first off by making 2 other comments, right? The first is that these kinds of arguments that you see to establish Pauline primacy, they really aren't at the same level of quality as the Petrine primacy texts. So, for example, you have the summative list that you talked about, especially in Matthew 10:2, where Peter's called protos, which is like first, principal, or chief. You have passages like Luke 22:31. And this one actually, Trent, till this day, I'm just like, wow, this passage is really remarkable. Jesus says to Simon, he says, Simon, Simon, Satan has come to, sift you all like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and so that when you return, you may strengthen your brothers. I'm like, that's incredible, right? So Satan is coming after all the apostles, and Jesus only expressly prays that Peter's faith may not fail so that he may come back and strengthen his brothers. I mean, there you see this elevation of Peter that's really remarkable. And then later, as as you know, as the night goes on, especially eventually the disciples, they fall asleep in the garden, right? Who does Jesus blame when they all fall asleep? If you look at the Gospel of Mark, Jesus and Matthew, Jesus names Peter as the one that he blames. And then when you go to John 21, and this is kind of just me kind of putting all the pieces together, who does Jesus forgive in John 21 explicitly? Peter. And so there's a sense in which when when the disciples fail, Peter is that chief representative. When the disciples succeed, Peter's the chief representative. Mm-hmm. And so actually in John 21, what I started noticing are these, what people call undesigned coincidences, right? Where things start coming together and you see a kind of harmony that is really striking. And so there's this idea that all the disciples fail, Jesus blames them. And then when all the disciples, except for John, of course, abandon basically Christ on the cross, it's through Peter that all of them receive the absolution, right? If Peter's forgiven, then all of them also receive the forgiveness in John 21.
The buck stops here.
Right.
All righty. Well, let's talk about some of those better examples, because you're right. I mean, I read the list a while ago, but just pointing out things that were unique to Paul, maybe on his seafaring voyages or who he wrote to. We don't make any of those similar arguments for Peter or for anything like that. Though, I mean, you might get into this a little bit because he brings up the point that Paul wrote the most in the New Testament. And I don't want to jump ahead too fast, but I can't help myself. It's my show. I can do what I want. He says, oh, well, Paul wrote so much. He wrote so much in the New Testament. Yeah, that's true. But how relevant is that? So I was thinking about it more. I thought, well, Peter also wrote. His writings are included in the New Testament. But unlike Paul, they're universal in scope. Paul's letters are to specific communities. Peter's have more of a universal application to them, which is something you would tend to see more with an office like his and being the leader of the church.
Well, I could see a response to that given 1 Corinthians 7:17, when Paul talks about a rule that he lays down in all the churches. And then obviously given the canon of scripture now, that is, Paul's texts are universal. But right. I mean, let's just,
And for me, like, I would not, it's why these arguments are helpful. That's why I would not press this argument myself in favor of petrine primacy, because of course, John writes letters that are received. They're not written to a particular audience either, or Jude or things like that. But it's just, I find it funny when they make these kinds of points, they are susceptible to kind of a different sorts of reply. So why don't I'll throw it back to you, bring up the examples you thought were the most promising that could show Paul had some kind of primacy and why they're not like the arguments for Peter's primacy.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first one that I have on the list, and I'm quoting from the website, number 20. He says, only Paul refers to himself as having a rod, a symbol of authority. And he quotes 1 Corinthians 4:21. Well, if you read 1 Corinthians 4:21, here's what Paul says. What do you desire? That I come to you with a rod or with love and a spirit of gentleness? So already this is kind of off to a bad start.
It's more of a misquote. He's not even saying I have one. He's saying, aren't you glad I didn't come to you with one?
Right. And it's very casual, right? Unlike, for instance, the keys of the kingdom, which play a major role in Matthew 16:19. So that's the first kind of thing to dock,
right? It's not like Aaron's rod. It's like the rod just a parent uses to whap their kid on the butt.
Like the book of Proverbs, right? Yeah. Don't spare the child the rod, you spoil him. Yeah. And then also, obviously here, in the case of Paul describing himself, right? This is an instance where Paul is saying, okay, look, let's just try to be charitable to this objection. Okay. So, I mean, Paul is saying that he can have this rod of discipline, right? But if you look at, for example, Matthew 16:19, the keys are being divinely given to Peter, right? So there's a sense in which there's something already, another point of difference between what Paul is saying here and what is being given to Peter, right? One is self-described with Paul with the rod. The other is divinely given with the keys to Peter. The third thing I'll point out too is that I just don't see, for instance, a typological argument like the Isaiah 22, Matthew 16 argument being able to be deployed here, right? And so already then we have three reasons why this is not a good parody, right? The first is that the metaphor is too casual with Paul's use of a rod of discipline. The second is that this rod, even if he has it, right, in some substantial way, it's self-described versus divinely given. The third thing is that you can't really draw a strong typological argument like an office of Eliakim in this case, as in the Peter case with the keys.
Very good. All right. What's the second one?
Oh, the second one is so this is the name count one, right? So the book of Acts, which mentions all of the apostles, this is number 8 on the website, discusses Paul more than any other apostle. Actually, that's number 11. Number 8 is Paul is mentioned more in the New Testament than any apostle, right? So one of the issues that I have with this is that like a mere name count is not entirely useful. Okay. So it might be the case that someone is present, let's say more often in the narrative, or they might be located in the room, right? But for instance, let's take like Acts 15. So obviously Paul is mentioned, but when you look at who gives the bulk of the speeches there, it's Peter and it's James, right? So not every instance where Paul is even mentioned is going to be an instance of him being a main or primary character, right? I mean, suppose, for instance, that Peter's mentioned, let's say, maybe 150 times in the New Testament. But let's suppose that every time he's mentioned, he is the primary character of the story. Whereas Paul, maybe half of the time he's a primary character, other times he's a background character. Well, that makes a difference, right? How often is this person a primary character?
Right.
And so just the mere name count, I'm going to say just right up front, it's not a good argument. And I don't think Catholics should use it either. I mean, if you really want to play it that way, like in the Gospels, Peter is mentioned the most of among all the apostles below Jesus Christ himself. All right. So we can kind of pick and choose, right? Like if I want to use this example, I can use the gospel examples, right? So, I mean, that's just not that's a non-starter.
It's not just that. It's not just quantity, it's quality. Like how is Peter referred to in the Gospels is what's more important. And you ably show that it's in a leadership capacity and other things like that.
And the other thing I'll say too is just, we mentioned this quote multiple times before, but it's worth mentioning again. In J.N.D. Kelly's book, The Anglican Scholar, A Dictionary of Popes, he talks about how Peter in the first 12 chapters of Acts has an undisputed leadership over the entire church, right? So in that instance too, you have Peter dominating the first 12 chapters of Acts. And now, of course, Paul is mentioned in the narrative as well. So it's not as if to nuance this objection, it's not as if Peter isn't there in the book of Acts. Clearly in the first 12 chapters, he does have this unique foundational role.
And Peter is depicted in a leadership role. The primary narratives in Acts are specifically about Paul's missionary journeys and other things, like when he's sent to Rome for imprisonment. They're narratological, they're narratives about Paul's life as a traveling missionary versus Peter's role, where you have a leadership capacity there.
Mm-hmm. All right, number 3. So this is another very popular one. It's Paul wrote more books of the New Testament than any other apostle.
There it is.
Right?
There it is.
So, I mean, there are 3 responses that I want to give, right? The first is that, look, I think there's an alternate explanation for why we have more of Paul's letters. And it's because Paul was literate. He was trained to be, he was trained under Rabbi Gamaliel. He was obviously literate. He obviously was very highly educated. Whereas in Acts 4:13, we know that Peter was illiterate. He was unlettered. He was quite ordinary in terms of his educational backdrop as a Galilean fisherman. So, I mean, already then it's like, well, we're not really assessing, let's say, what that person was objectively given by God, right? If they were given a primacy. So suppose like, we look at the amount of books that Trent Horn has written versus the amount of books that Pope Francis has written, right? And let's say we see that Trent Horn has written more books. Does that mean that he has a greater authority?
Right. Or think about that same argument. You could say, well, Paul had more, and there's people who do. This isn't it is a crazy view, but this is a view some people hold, which is that Paul has more authority to us than Jesus does. You have dispensationalists who hold this view. And you could argue, well, Paul had more authority in the church because he wrote more than Jesus did. Jesus didn't write anything, but it's right. The arguments just fall apart.
I mean, the other thing, too, that I should mention is, even though we are indebted to Paul for giving us a lot to think about in terms of justification and in terms of just the relationship between Israel and the church, Peter's testimony is our primary source of Jesus, right? So if we were trying to reconstruct the life of Jesus from Paul, we could get some substantial details like the death, the resurrection, some miracles, some teaching on divorce. But in terms of what we primarily know about Jesus, the stories that we love, right? If you believe in Mark in priority, then Mark based his testimony off of Peter, right? And so Peter's voice is actually the chief voice by which all of us gain access to the life and teachings of Christ. And so even there, like when we look at the New Testament, just doing a mere number count is not going to be helpful, right? And also, I don't like viewing the New Testament as competing, right? Where, oh, well, Peter wrote Peter's witness is the primary source of the Gospels, whereas Paul's is the pastoral letters. It's like, okay, no, let's not do that, right? Let's not put them in conflict. The last thing I want to say is this. So I've noticed there's
I apologize. Yeah. I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but what you said there, I think that's very helpful, because I've noticed Protestants who put the New Testament in conflict. They'll say, well, Jesus didn't really teach about justification. That was Paul's job in Galatians. And it's like, no, now you're like trying to make excuses instead of looking at it as like an entire whole. I feel like sometimes I see that on the other side a little bit more, instead of, trying to, setting Paul and James and Paul or Jesus in conflict with each other in this regard. So I apologize. I didn't mean to set you. I just noticed that, but I don't want to derail the train.
No, I appreciate it. So the third, the last point I want to make here is just also a kind of like a fallacy that I've noticed in a lot of Protestant thought. And it's this idea that the New Testament documents and texts are identical to the events themselves, right? So what the New Testament is, it's the obviously with the canon, it's the divinely authorized and privileged inerrant witness for what happened, right? But just because, for instance, Paul wrote more books in the New Testament, that doesn't mean that he is, if you will, more of the New Testament times, or he's more of the New Testament age, right?
Interesting.
So the text is giving us a kind of window, right? But let's suppose that, Paul is just the one who's the most vocal, right? That doesn't mean that he is the bulk of the New Testament. What we're doing is we have to look underneath the text to try and picture everything that's going on. And so just because, right, Paul wrote most of the New Testament, that doesn't mean he is most of the New Testament, or he is everything that happened, so to speak. So that's just another nuance I want to bring in, because a lot of scholars, what they've done is when they've tried to reconstruct the history of the early church and picture, what exactly was going on, they noticed like, okay, we really have a lot of Paul's perspective, right, which is great. But it seems as if when we look at how the earliest Christians remembered Peter versus Paul, right, Peter was remembered, especially when you look at the Gospels, which, come a few decades later. Peter is remembered very highly. And also, from what I can recall, almost all the early heretics in the church, they were split on the person of Paul. Paul was something like a polarizing figure.
Yeah.
Whereas recent scholars have argued Peter seems to have been kind of more universally loved and remembered in the church.
Interesting. All right. What's the next one?
So the next one is Paul is the only apostle who is called God's chosen vessel, who will bear his name before Jews and Gentiles. And this is Acts chapter 9, verse 15. So this is when, Saul is on his way to persecute Christians. And then, Jesus appears. And then Ananias is told by God, hey, you need to, bring Paul into the church and heal him. And so one of the points here is that God is saying, yes, like Paul is his chosen vessel to reach the Jews and the Gentiles, to reach their kings, right? And so this is a very significant honor given to Paul. And so I think we should just emphasize that, okay, at the same time that we're nuancing, let's say, arguments for Pauline primacy, that doesn't mean that Paul doesn't have a special importance in the New Testament.
Right. He's not a nobody.
Exactly. Now, the problem with this objection is that, look, if you like, obviously when God calls someone his chosen vessel, that is a very important and special title. But you can't say that this is a title that only Paul has, because in Acts chapter 15, verse 7, in the Jerusalem Council, Peter stands and he says, brothers, in the early days that God chose me from among you, that by my mouth, the Gentiles would be received into the church, right? And so Peter's also saying that he was distinctively chosen by God to bring the Gentiles into the church, to minister to both Jews and Gentiles, right? So what we're already seeing here then is we can't say that Paul only has this title when we see Peter claim a similar one for himself and with divine authorization claimed with it, right? So in both contexts then, what I think what we can say is that, look, I have no problem saying that God chose Peter and Paul in a special way to minister to the Jews and to the Gentiles. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that.
Right.
Right.
So,
and
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say too, like when God says my chosen vessel, right, there is something exclusive and special about that, right? But, obviously that can't be to the exclusion of Peter. So for example, I could say, for instance, this is my chosen water bottle, right? And what I'm saying is that at this moment, I'm highlighting and forwarding this one. It has my authorization, it has my seal of approval. Likewise, if God says, this is my chosen vessel, right? Well, he's emphasizing Paul and he's saying, this guy has my certification. That doesn't mean he's the only one with my certification, but it's a way of saying he is certified. Does that make sense? There's a difference between saying, hey, this is my chosen vessel and it's only him, versus what I think God is saying here is, yeah, Paul is my authorized vessel, right? He has my certification. But
Right,
being the chosen vessel isn't just a singular exclusive position.
Yeah, he has a stamp of approval for a prophetic mission. That
Right.
All that verse is saying is that Paul was given a prophetic mission. And we see in Acts 15, Peter was given a prophetic mission. Or what about John the Baptist? That same language is used to describe him. That the church, will always have, every baptized person is called to be priest, prophet, and king. And so there are going to be multiple prophetic missions. And of course, each apostle and their successor has juridical authority within the church, but it doesn't mean that there isn't someone who's given supremacy or primacy.
Right.
That language is more about, you're right, the prophetic mission, which is something that's shared amongst different people. It's not exclusive.
Yeah, and so at this point too, I just want to say that, like, obviously none of these kind of Pauline primacy texts contradict, Roman Catholic belief.
Right.
The other thing I want to mention too is just a distinction, and this will be helpful as we go into these last 2 points.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to distinguish between objective versus subjective authority, right? So objective authority is an instance where someone has authority independent of, let's say, the approval of the people or their charisma, right? So for instance, let's say that, Trent, you and I are brothers, right? And you're my older brother. And, let's say dad leaves you behind as the one in charge. Mm-hmm. So objectively speaking, no matter what I say, I can't change the fact that you were given this authority over me, right? So in that sense, that's an objective authority. But let's suppose that I'm the more vocal younger brother, right? I'm very intelligent. I'm very witty. I know how to run and manipulate, and I know how to do all these things, right? I am very skilled. Well, in some sense, some people might say, oh, well, Suan has greater authority, right? Because he's the one who's more vocal, right? And so this is subjective or received authority.
He's the one who always gets what he wants.
Right. And so, but for instance, if you assert your objective authority that was given to you by dad, then that would actually count for something, right? And so what we're looking for here is, I think we have good evidence, especially with the Petrine primacy text that I've introduced and that we've talked about, where Peter has an objective handed down authority from Christ, a primacy given over all the other apostles. Whereas I think Paul has great subjective authority. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have authorized authority or he doesn't have objective authority from God, right? But that it's not at the same kind of level as Peter or even above Peter, right? But he does have a great subjective authority by virtue of his great charisma and calling to the gospel.
All right, number 5.
So number 5 is Paul is the only apostle who refers to his authority over all the churches, right? And it's like, okay, well, so let me just actually include the scriptures. So 1 Corinthians 4:17, 7:17, and then 2 Corinthians 11:28, right? I mean, so the first problem with this is, okay, even if Paul's the only one who refers to his authority over all the churches, so what, right? I mean, all the apostles have authority over the church, right? All of them have this kind of universal power, so to speak. And so I don't think that's necessarily problematic. Now, I do want to include a nuance.
So when you say all of them has authority, that means like when Thomas preaches in India, it doesn't mean like he loses his status as an apostle if he goes back to Italy or something.
Right, right. All of them have the status as being apostle no matter where they go. Now, one argument that people will give, though, is that, hey, this type of language that Paul's using, this is like very papal language, right? So why doesn't, Peter talk this way or something like that? So I just want to include like a nuance that needs to be remembered here, right? So the apostles have a unique authority, right? Because they are the chief guardians of the deposit of the faith, right? Scripture and tradition. But not only that, I mean, one could argue that they are, in a sense, the deposit of the faith, especially Paul and Peter and the others who wrote epistles, right? So the apostolic deposit has universal authority over the church. And the apostles, being the chief guardians, they can have universal rule, right, through accessing that deposit and teaching definitively with it, right? So Paul has authority not by virtue of being Paul, but by virtue of being an apostle. Now,
especially one inspired to write scripture.
Exactly. The distinction, however, with Peter is that Peter does have authority by virtue of being an apostle. But the argument of Roman Catholics is that Peter has an authority by virtue of being Peter, right? So the authority that was given to Peter is a uniquely kind of Petrine authority. So, for example, when the Pope declares something ex cathedra, he's not declaring it as an apostle. What he's doing is he's declaring it, as it were, as if he were Peter, as he's in the chair of Peter. And so remember going back to Luke 22:31, where Peter is kind of the safeguard or the protector of the apostles, right? The apostles are the chief safeguard of the deposit of the faith. But who is the chief safeguard of the guardians? It's Peter.
Right. So
Peter has this dual role as not only an apostle, as a brother, but also as an elder brother and a protector. And so here, I don't think it's problematic at all that Paul claims to have this kind of universal authority to teach, right? Because what he's doing is he's accessing the deposit of the faith, and he's saying, through this deposit, I'm teaching, right? But then when we go to other passages, like for instance, I was reading St. Thomas Aquinas' commentary in the Gospel of Matthew. What Aquinas argues is that the apostles receive the keys of the kingdom and the power to bind and loose through Peter, right? So notice that Paul, when he teaches and he gives his authority, he's accessing the authority of the gospel of the deposit of the faith, which Peter can do as well. But also the other apostles through Peter receive unique blessings, receive protection. And so that's where you can establish supremacy, by showing that Peter has authority qua or by virtue of being Peter, and that Peter is this chief protector of the apostles. The other thing I want to mention too, Trent, just really quick, is that, obviously Paul's letters predate the Gospels, right? But that actually stands to benefit the case for, Petrine primacy, because what the Gospels reflect is the early Christian communities, along with the eyewitness testimony, reflecting upon the legacy of Peter.
Right.
And so when you see these memories of Peter come out, these examples of his primacy and his importance, it's also the early Christian community remembering the legacy and the role of Peter. And so, once again, I think that we need to remember that the Gospels represent kind of the summative thought of even the early Christians and their beliefs about Peter.
Right. These are the stories that survive, that were told more frequently, and were then highlighted in sharing the gospel.
Right. Okay, so here's my sixth and last one.
All right.
So it's Paul is the only apostle who publicly rebukes and corrects another apostle, and this is Galatians 2:11.
Yeah. Classic.
So, and I actually had an article published on Catholic Answers on the day that we filmed this, which responds to this objection.
All right. Well, I'll link to it. I'll link to it below then when the video airs.
Yeah. So I'll just say just a few things. The first thing is that what's going on in Galatians 2:11, right, is there's a situation where, in Antioch, the Jewish, or I think it takes place in Antioch or in Jerusalem, but regardless, the emissaries of James, they come, right? They're the circumcision faction. This is generally regarded as occurring after the Acts 15 council, where they declared that, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised.
Yeah.
And Peter, when he's confronted by the emissaries of James for dining with Gentile Christians, Peter ends up kind of chickening out, right? And he moves away. And then this causes a scandal. And then eventually, Paul is super upset because he's saying that he's the chief minister. Paul is the chief minister to the Gentiles. And he points out that, Barnabas and the other Jewish Christians follow Peter's lead, right, when he does this. So the first thing that I want to point out is that this is not rebuking Peter for false teaching.
Right.
Okay, so this doesn't fall under papal infallibility. He's pointing out a moral fault in Peter for chickening out. Right. The second thing that I want to point out, too, is it's kind of telling how, some people will say that, after, let's say, the first 12 chapters of Acts, Peter kind of loses importance. Right. Or maybe he returns in Acts 15, but his influence is, that's it. Right. Well, this would occur after Acts 15. And in this example, what happens is Peter, right, he does a simple action of not dining with Gentile Christians. And that causes the Jewish Christians and Barnabas to actually choose follow the lead of Peter over a council. Mm-hmm. That's significant.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. And then even the other point to point out too is
he'd scandalized them through inaction that he may not have even intended.
Right. I mean, the other thing to point out too is that Barnabas was also Paul's right-hand man, right? I mean, he's there with him throughout the stories. He's there being a minister to the Gentiles. He's there in Acts 15 alongside Paul, speaking at the Jerusalem council. But here, Paul doesn't actually directly rebuke Barnabas. He focuses his rebuke on Peter because he recognizes that it's really Peter whose kind of example here has the most sway, right? So that's the second point. The third and last point I want to just say here is that despite all of that has been said so far, I don't think it's been demonstrated that there's an objective, divinely instituted hierarchy of Paul over Peter, or even of Paul being equal to Peter, right? I think certainly there are examples of Paul's importance, of his boldness in preaching the gospel, right? But when we look at the whole synoptic picture of the evidence for the papacy, I don't think I found anything really here that convinced me that, okay, Paul was the real pope. And the last thing I'll say is this, Trent. I mean, it's the see of Peter and Paul, the Roman see, right? I mean, it claims succession from Peter and Paul. And so, I mean, all I'm saying is you're kind of sweetening the deal then for the church in Rome if you highlight the Pauline, text, because it's really the see of both of the apostles, right? So, I mean, I don't have any objections there. Sure. So I think that's everything I have to say here.
I'll add one point on Galatians for you, and then we'll close it out. I guess 2 points. So one would be, we would have to understand that the language Paul uses for himself, Galatians is told from his own point of view. It's his letter. So I think authority claims we derive from it comes, how he tells a story. He's telling it from his perspective. Whereas it's striking to compare that to Matthew, where we have the Apostle Matthew, who is narrating what has transpired in Peter being given the keys. So it's interesting. We have a different third-party perspective on any kind of an authority claim. That's a minor point. The more major point I would bring up is that the fact that Paul goes on and on about how he went up against Peter, that's indirect evidence of Peter's authority. Because in Galatians, the main objection to Paul is that he's a man pleaser. He just wants people to love him. So he is just trying to please other people. And Paul goes to great lengths to say, I didn't get the gospel from men. I got it from God. I don't care about pleasing people. I'm not here to make people happy. And then he adds into that, that there's other people in the church he's not going to be intimidated by or try to please. And he says, I even opposed Cephas to his face. So it's interesting there. I mean, that would be like if I said, if I was a representative in Congress and someone said, look, you're just trying to move your way up in the chain. You're trying to please all the people in the Senate. And you said, no, I don't care what the senators think. I told the president to his face that he was wrong. Now, why would you? And so in saying that, you're actually saying, look, I went to the highest guy in the room and I still said what I said and I don't care. And so to me, that's I always think of Paul as a melancholic temperament because I have a melancholic temperament. And I feel it's very similar in that regards there. So that's what I've noticed in that episode. Where can people, so you published at Catholic.com, and I'm sure you've got other resources, some great debates you've done that are on YouTube, but anything else you want to share or recommend for people?
Not at the moment. I mean, I'm just going to be publishing, hopefully in due time, some lectures, and I'm hopefully going to be able to finish an article that I'm writing on typology that will help Catholic apologists make it better, typological arguments. That'll be on my academia.edu page, and just type in my name. But that's about it for right now. I'm also trying to record some lectures to kind of give my summative thoughts on the Peter Eliakim typology argument. I had our friend Joe Schmid help me kind of revise it a little bit and make it stronger. So, I have the Joe Schmid seal of approval, I guess.
Wait, Schmid or Heschmeyer?
Oh, Joe Schmid.
Wow.
Yeah. So I asked Joe to help me kind of, polish it and everything and just reorganize the logic.
I would love to. So for folks who don't know, Joe Schmid is he's a baptized Catholic, but he's an agnostic, and he does Majesty of Reason. That's so funny. I should ask him what he thinks about Catholicism versus Protestantism as an agnostic. But he's a logical guy. He's a sharp thinker. So I'm glad he's doing that. That's cool.
Yep. And that's about it, Trent.
All righty. Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Suan. I'll link to your article below. And thank you guys all for listening. And I hope that you all have a very blessed day.
Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.